Okay. Firstly, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak at this forum. I just have to move this. Sorry, my computer's jumping around a bit. Come on. Okay. In my abstract for this presentation, I included a table of readings from the Latin witnesses of the Synoptic Gospel. This table, which you can see in the slide in front of you, highlights a phenomenon previously discussed by White, Nestle, Burkett, and Horton, namely that there are a few startling fragments of vocabulary that are peculiar to the Latin version of Mark as against that of Matthew and Luke. In this paper, I will discuss this interesting phenomenon while also highlighting the complexity associated with any examination of the Latin biblical tradition. I move on for now, but the table that you have in front of you will make a reappearance in the near future. So you'll have plenty of time to have a look at it, I hope. The case of comminari was first noted by Henry White in 1888 in volume 3 of Old Latin Biblical Texts. White discusses the relationship between Old Latin manuscript VL13, here identified as Q, and its relationship with the rest of the Latin textual tradition. And on the left-hand side of your presentation, you see the table from White, which outlines the variations associated with comminari. White's table is extremely helpful in elucidating the relationship between B, VL4, and Q, which is the point of the exercise. He also draws attention to the complexity of the Latin textual tradition by noting that epitomal is translated in no less than 11 ways. While White notes this variation in his text and in the table, he does not explore the reasons why it is present. Latin variation, associated with epitomal, is next noted by Eberhard Nestle in a 1907 article on the Gospels in the Latin Vulgate. Nestle draws attention to the difference in Latin renderings across the Latin Gospel tradition and surmises that this is most likely due to each book being translated independently. And I have summarised Nestle's data on the right-hand side in the table there, and you can see the items of Greek that he's highlighted, and then each column here represents what he states within the text about the relationship of the respective Vulgate Gospel translation in relation to that Greek. So here, for example, Matthew translates Archieros 25 times and has princeps sacerdotum 24 of those times, while Mark, for example, has summus sacerdos 16 times. So we can see that the princeps in the summus is something that's particular to Matthew and Mark. And the omissions from Luke is because in those specific examples, Nestle does not talk about Luke. Nestle notes several examples, or we might refer to them as fragments, where the rendering of the respective Gospels differ despite the underlying Greek remaining static. In the slide, we're seeing a table summary of Nestle's examples. So I'll just move forward, which is what I just showed you. In 1908, in response to Nestle, F.C. Burkett penned 2 articles in the Journal of Theological Studies exploring this type of variation in more detail. One of these articles built directly upon Nestle's own examination of high priest in the Latin Gospels. And this is just the tables from Burkett's article. As you can see, there's a lot of data in there. And I'm not going to go any further into that just now or in this paper. The other article, which is on the right-hand side, added to this discussion by positing a further relevant example associated with the use of secus in association with para in the Synoptic Gospels. So now we're back to our table. I'll just also, I forgot to mention, apologies. More recently, Hugh. More recently, Burton, in his volume on the Old Latin Gospels, refers to both Nestle and Burkett's work on these specific variations. Burton, as summarised by Horton, discerns a single common source for the extant manuscripts of Mark, and the key phrase is the following phrase is key, albeit different in places from the other Synoptic Gospels. So we've got peculiar readings in Mark. The one I'm going to talk about mostly today is comminari. And these are independent and unique compared to what we find in the parallel passages and of Matthew and Luke, and also in those passages which use epitomal. So in summary, there's a consensus among modern scholars that each gospel book, including Mark, may be traced back to an original Latin translation, but that these translations were done independently. Variation and similarities across the textual tradition of the Latin Synoptic Gospels, such as that associated with comminari, may therefore be due to a number of reasons, including, but not limited to, the vagaries of the original translation, revision within the textual tradition of a specific book, ongoing revision according to the Greek, and assimilation to parallel text in the Latin Gospels. So all that complexity is what we need to consider when we're talking about comminari in Mark. And now I return to my original table of epitomal in Mark 10:48. As you can see here, we're looking at epitomal and the Latin translation of this term in parallel passages from the Synoptic Gospels. Mark 10:48, Matthew 20:31, and Luke 18:39. A brief glance at this table demonstrates that, as has been noted over the past 130 years, there is something peculiar associated with comminari in Mark 10:48. A large number of Latin manuscripts support the use of comminari as against the use of increpare in Matthew and Luke. So as you can see, pretty clear, the first column, we have lots of witnesses, and we move across to in Mark. Then in the second and third lines, we have Matthew and Luke, and our majority of witnesses here are going with increpare. However, a more in-depth look at Mark 10:48 informs us that this phenomenon is not universally apparent within the Latin Markan tradition. Indeed, two manuscripts, often cited as key representatives of specific text types, VL1 or K, Codex Bobiensis, which is associated with the African or K text type, and VL3, A or Codex Werkelensis, a European text with the strong admixture of African readings, or Heloix D text, as it might be referred to, do not use comminari, but resort to alternative Latin vocabulary at this point. So obviously, VL1 and VL3 are doing something different to what's happening in the rest of the manuscript tradition, but I would also point out that even though they are doing something different to comminari, they are not doing something, not using increpare like we find in Matthew and Luke. As a quick aside, we might ask at this point whether the verses being discussed offer up any other relevant variation. The answer to this is no. While there is variation apparent within the Latin textual tradition of these verses, the only significant variation is associated with the Lucan proagontes, or the Vulgate prebant. So I'm not going to go into that any further, but you can see that Luke has this additional lexical item, and there's definitely variation associated with that, but I'm not going to go into that any further as it's not relevant to the discussion, as we don't find it in Matthew and Mark at this point. So I'm going to move on to show you a quick representation of comminari and epitomal within the Synoptic Gospels. Now, I acknowledge that this is not the optimal way of displaying this data, but in reality, I didn't know how best to show this within a forum such as this. So I will move forward with the next couple of slides. So please don't feel overwhelmed. It's more about understanding the patterns that are happening here. If I can get my mouse to work, there we go. So a more extensive examination of the use of comminari and epitomal in the Synoptic Gospels produces a table large enough to be impractical for this forum. However, a cut down version of the table, which I have presented in the following 3 slides, demonstrates that the phenomenon associated with comminari is not limited to Mark 10:48. So there are 3 slides that look pretty much the same as this. We have Mark and its parallel passages, and the vocabulary across the Latin manuscripts or Old Latin manuscripts is down here with the Vulgate in the center here. K and E up the top here, and A in pink. And as we can see, we have comminari here and a lack of comminari, I would say at this point, within Matthew and Luke. And this pattern repeats itself as we move through these slides. Again, same patterns are happening, but I have to draw attention to the fact that while comminari is static within the Vulgate and the associated manuscript tradition here, it's definitely not the same thing that's happening in the representatives of the African and early European texts. And there's one more, so I'll let it sit there for a moment. When we look at these tables, it is clear that there is systematic usage of particular vocabulary across the synoptic and manuscript tradition. The following conclusions may be stated. VL1 and VL2, our African texts, or K texts, or K and C, depending what we discover later today, regularly attest corpere. You actually can't, at least you can see it there, and to a lesser extent, increpare across the Synoptic Gospels. This aligns with Heloic's K and C texts. VL3, with some variation, regularly attests obligare across the Synoptic Gospels, and this aligns with Heloic's D text, which considers the closest witness to Greek Bese and Codex Washingtonensis. The Vulgate attests comminari in Mark and increpare in Matthew and Luke, a reading also generally supported by Heloic's I text type, sometimes also the J text type, a European text with an admixture of readings from the Vulgate and the Old Latin textual tradition. Given the ambiguous relationship of the Vulgate and the manuscripts of the I text type, we must consider the possibility that comminari in Mark is associated with Jerome's edition of the Gospels. However, based on this one example, I believe it is too difficult to establish this definitively. I do think it would be worth examining further this kind of variation in relation to Jerome and the I text type. So this brief exercise demonstrates that it's worth looking across a tradition, here the Synoptic Gospels, as well as within the manuscript tradition of a specific book. While there is no denying the primary role assigned to a book's inner textual tradition, there is also reason to look across the fence to other related textual traditions, here the Synoptic Gospels, which may be helpful in further illuminating the textual history of the book being discussed, as Mark in this case. As edited by Heloic and noted above, comminari in Mark is associated with the Italian or I text type. I must agree with Heloic that the use of comminari is distinctive of a specific substratum of the Latin Markan tradition, possibly associated with a pre-Vulgate text. While it is one thing to state this conclusion, it is another to explore further the ramifications of this evidence and to consider why such variation exists. So I'm going to move on from just looking at the association of comminari and epitomeo and look at several other issues associated with comminari in the Latin textual tradition. I'll just move forward my slide. Okay, so other uses of comminari in the Latin Synoptic Gospels. In both Mark 1:43, where are we? There we go, and Matthew 9:30, we find comminari in the Latin text. However, at this point, it is associated with embrimalmai, not epitomeo. In the Latin textual tradition of both Matthew 9:30 and Mark 1:43, embrimalmai is translated by comminari across the entire available manuscript tradition. So there is no variation in K or E if we have them, or A. So for Matthew 9:30, we have all manuscripts, including K, and where K is, we often do not have E, so we don't have E there. But in Mark 1:43, with possible influence from Washingtonensis and B's, no, just Washingtonensis in this case, there's been omissions. So we find that E and VL4 or VL2 and VL4 and VL6 and VL25 actually omit the relevant part of the verse here. So what this shows us is that, as well as comminari being associated with epitomao, in a couple of examples in the Synoptic Gospels, we have comminari associated with embrimalmai. Now, this is without variation within the manuscript tradition, whereas when we're looking at epitomeo, there is quite a lot of variation within the manuscripts. The second item I'd like to point out in association with comminari in the synoptic textual tradition of the Latin Gospels, if my slide will move forward, is variation in the underlying Greek. So I draw your attention to Matthew 16:20, a synoptic parallel to Mark 8:30, one of our comminari passages. So again, in this slide, the most important thing, of course, is, well, not of course, but the most important thing is this column in the middle here. Here in Matthew 16:20, we find the majority of Latin manuscripts reading precipere or imperare in response to the Greek diastelu. However, as noted in Nestle Island, we also have the Greek text of Beze and Codex Vaticanus attesting epitomao. This Greek variant is supported in the Latin evidence by the increpare of VL2 or E and comminatus of VLD, or 5D. So I include this example to highlight that the ongoing relationship between the Greek and Latin texts, and I include it to show that, and how variation in the Greek can indeed be attested within the Latin textual tradition. By extension, I would go as far to posit that evidence for Greek variation may be extant within the Latin textual tradition without support from surviving Greek manuscripts. This example is a case in point. Without the attested support from Beze and Vaticanus, we would most likely not be suggesting that VL1 and VL5 independently preserve an alternative Greek reading. So, and finally, in our little foray into the Latin text, I would like to look at comminari and epitomao in Jerome in Psalms. We might wonder if there is evidence elsewhere in the Latin textual tradition, such as the Old Testament, where comminari is regularly associated with epitomao. Determining this is more difficult than one might expect. Just as the discussion of textual variation in the Latin text of a gospel is complicated, so too is an examination of the Latin textual tradition of the Old Testament. Such examinations must consider the text of the various Greek versions, such as the Septuagint, Symmachus, Aquila, Theodotion, textual variation within these versions, as well as possible influence from the Hebrew, whether via the original text or the translations of Jerome. We are also hamstrung by the lack of resources, as is true for the New Latin New Testament. There is no index of the older Latin text of the Old Testament, so we must therefore resort to accessing relevant examples via indexes of both the Vulgate by searching for comminari and the Greek. In this case, we are looking for epitomao. So in this slide here, we have the Septuagint reading here with epitomao. The other refers to what we might find in Aquila or Symmachus, so Aquila AQ, Symmachus SM. And then we have the first column here is Jerome's translation according to the Hebrew. And the second one is the Vulgate translation. And then here, the last column is the older Latin textual tradition. The Vulgate text of Psalms, as you can see along here, is closely associated with the older Latin textual tradition. It is possible that this text is as a result of a revision by Jerome based on the Greek text, akin to his revision of the Gospels. However, the very close textual parallels between the Vulgate text and known exemplars of the older Latin textual tradition means that we can treat with due care the text of the Vulgate as representative of the older Latin textual tradition. This is, of course, not the case for many books of the Vulgate Old Testament. So by limiting our discussion, due to time, of course, but also due to convenience, the Vulgate text of Psalms is considered an older Latin text. And this provides us with a way of accessing, using the indexes and online tools to search for certain items of vocabulary, such as comminari, or in this case, increpare. In Psalms, we find increpare for epitomao across almost the whole Latin tradition, including Jerome's Psalms according to the Hebrew. So here, they're all the same readings, except for comminatus, here in blue, in Psalm 105. There is one exception to this pattern. In Psalm 105, Jerome's translation according to the Hebrew, we find comminatus for epitomao. And I will note here that there is no extant Greek variation for this verse, so there's nothing in field that can help us maybe identify why this vocabulary has been used at this point. Despite this anomaly, it is clear that in the older Latin tradition of Psalms, and nearly always in Jerome, we find increpare for epitomao. I raise a final two examples associated with comminari in Psalms. This time solely in conjunction with Jerome's version according to the Hebrew. Here we find comminari an additional 2 times in Jerome's text, Psalm 7:12 and Psalm 77:49. The confused nature of the Latin evidence from Psalm 77:49, along with the lack of epitomao or embrymalmai in the underlying Greek, means that this example must be dismissed for now. However, the text of Psalm 7:12 and subsequent commentary in red provided by Jerome draws a direct line between the Hebrew, translated here by Jerome as comminatur, the text of Aquila. Jerome notes that Aquila beautifully translates the Hebrew as comminans et infrendens, and the comminans of his own text of Psalms, which is here. I also wanted to point out that here in the Greek textual tradition, we do actually attest embrymalmai. And this is a reading of Aquila, so we can equate what Jerome is saying about Aquila here in his Latin with what we actually find in the Greek manuscript tradition of Aquila's version of Psalms. So to summarize, the use of comminari. In Mark 10:48, we find the Latin text of a selection of manuscripts attesting a reading, comminari, otherwise not found in the parallel passages of Latin, Luke, and Mark. We've also established that this variation is not limited to one passage, but is actually present in these manuscripts in association with epitomao across the whole of the Markan text. Contrary to this, we find increpare and other readings for epitomao in the Latin textual tradition of Matthew and Luke. In Matthew 9:20 and Mark 1:43, we find the whole of the available Latin manuscript tradition using comminari for embrymalmai. In Matthew 16:20, a parallel passage to Mark 8:30, one of our comminari passages, we note Greek variation, and this variation is actually apparent within the Latin textual tradition. Finally, I demonstrated that in the Latin textual traditions of Psalms, including that associated with Jerome, epitomao is almost invariably translated as increpare, with one exception. However, comminari is found in Jerome's version, but here it is associated with Aquila's comminari, as Jerome translates it, or embrymalmai, as we find in the Greek textual tradition. This list, or this summary, clearly shows the complexity at play during any discussion of the Latin biblical text. So finally, taking the above into consideration that there is association of comminari with embrymalmai in Matthew 9:30, Mark 1:43, and Jerome's translation of Psalms, and the possibility of Greek variation being attested within the late Latin textual tradition, I would like to suggest that the introduction of comminari in the Latin text of Mark, rather than being the result of a linguistic or theological preference, is actually evidence of a different underlying Greek, most likely embrymalmai. We might consider this a fragment of a text now lost to us. However, without forthcoming support from the extant Greek textual tradition, I acknowledge that this conclusion is pure speculation. Finally, I do believe that, at the very least, this paper has demonstrated the complexity associated with any study of the older Latin text. In conclusion, I would like to paraphrase F.C. Burkett. It is difficult to realize the facts about the extant text of the Gospels in Latin, and I would actually suggest all books of the Latin Bible, and even more difficult still to reconstruct their history. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simone. I shall allow a moment for applause and emojis of applause to be presented. Now we have time for 2 or 3 questions, if there are, on specific matters which Simone has raised, either by using the raise hand function in the reactions button or by typing your question into chat. So feel free to use either of those ways of asking a question. and then we can have a broader discussion as well once Pete has brought his own contribution into the mix after that. Joey, I see your hand. Over to you first.
Thank you, and thank you for that talk. Forgive any misunderstanding on my part, but do you know if there's any overlap between the Old Latin manuscripts that read comminari throughout Mark and the ones that portray Jesus as being angry at the leper in Mark 1:41?
Do you mean textually? Because I probably would not. I'm not quite sure what the question. Are you,
Okay,
is it about a Greek variation? You're referring to a Greek variant?
Well, there's a Greek variant, but also it is mostly found in the Latin tradition.
Yeah.
And I was curious because
Mark 1:43. I'd have to go back and have a look at what I've got here. I couldn't answer it straight off the top of my head. Apologies.
Oh, it's all right.
That's fine. That's something to take forward then again. Any more questions or observations that anyone would like to raise at this point? I think I followed you until you're up to your penultimate slide, Simone, and then I thought conjectural emendation of the Greek based on the Latin was something which was getting me very worried. The trouble you face at Matthew 16:20 is presumably the difference in the Greek verb there between enetelator and enebrimata or whatever, is because it is the synoptic parallel. And so you see the influence of synoptic parallels exerting themselves on Greek scribes. To what extent, I wonder, are we secure in identifying the Latin variations as slavish following of Greek variations rather than exactly the same variation happening in Latin tradition as in Greek, and therefore the likelihood of synoptic harmonization or the assimilation being such that we can't actually draw any firm conclusions than what's going on at that point?
And I would actually totally agree with you on that. I mean, just your actual question demonstrates how complex the situation is. I think there is definitely places, and that may not be one, where the Latin does preserve evidence for Greek variation, and that was mainly the point that I wanted to draw out there, that there is a possibility for this to occur. So while that may not be the best example ever, I do think that that it's one that should be made, or at least the statement should be made that the Latin does preserve readings that represent variation within the Greek text, and sometimes we may not have that Greek text, but it's definitely not always the case.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And looking at the Psalms to try to determine what Jerome's favorite vocabulary was does seem methodologically to me to be a reasonable use. So nobody else is putting up their hand or waving. There's nobody whom I'm overlooking. So I think at that point we will thank you again and move to Pete.